There's a good chance that you're doing your stats wrong in Diablo 4, and this isn't clickbait. Diablo 4 has a lot of different stats and numbers and percentages, and everything is all over the place. I'm going to try to go over this with a little bit of math, make a very complicated topic pretty simple and fast. Multiplicative versus additive. If you know anything about damage numbers in video games, this is super important. To put it simply, do not just add random stats and numbers and go, oh, hey, plus whatever to bleed, plus whatever to poison. It's not going to add up to as much damage as you think it is. And the reason is damage is divided up into little buckets. Instead of thinking about damage as it all goes into one place, there are different buckets of damage. Different types of effects go into different buckets, and then those are added together to get your total damage. What I mean by this is if you went into your categories and you can see you have critical strike, you have overpower, you have vulnerable, you have versus enemies, you have with enemies, there's a whole bunch of them, tons of them. But you're not going to get the same amount of damage from adding a bunch of versus stats, like versus slowed, versus stunned, versus dazed. That is all going to add up into one bucket. It's in the versus bucket. If you want to drastically increase your damage, you need to put into varying buckets and make sure that they're all high level instead of just putting into one bucket. So what's going to happen is I hit, it takes my damage, multiplies my damage by each bucket, and that's the final number that comes out, depending on what was relevant and what wasn't. So let's quickly go over the buckets. Right here, you have the first bucket is your main stat. Every class has a main stat, and you can tell what it's doing by just hovering over it. So here I have dexterity is adding 43% damage to my core skill. So the second bucket is critical strike damage. It's my crit damage, then that is multiplied by another bucket, the vulnerable damage. Do not ignore this bucket, it's super important. Then that gets all multiplied by another bucket, the versus bucket. And that is everything in this category here that says versus. Now you only really want to pay attention to the ones that are relevant to your build. Right now, I'm not really slowing people, so I don't care too much about this. I wouldn't count that in the bucket. Then there's the damage with category, and that is anything that says damage with. Those are all going to be like core keyword damages that you have. For rogue, it's going to be poison, shadow, dual wield, cutthroat, marksman. Any of those keywords tells you what it's going to do. So if you're like, oh, is this a marksman skill? Is this a cutthroat skill? Is this a this skill? You can look into your abilities, and it'll tell you those little boxes at the top. It says which keyword it is, and it'll tell you if it's buffing that. Then you have damage from. There's not a lot of damage from, but I have 20% bonus after I dodge. These are just various small effects, but it is its own bucket. So it's very important if you see something like that and you don't have a lot in the category, that it might be more important and more beneficial to your build than another stat that you have a ton of. Like damage versus, I have 360% damage in there. Another 20% isn't going to be as crucial as multiplying everything by 20%. Another category is damage while. This isn't a very large category and it's very niche, so some of it may be like damage while healthy or damage while a werewolf, damage while doing something. There's only going to be a few, but it's another category all by itself. And then there's a final damage bucket that is just considered like all damage, and it's anything that doesn't fall into this category. Examples of this are like damage from an elite kill. Like there are some abilities after you kill an elite, you get a damage bonus. That would be one of them. Like various nodes on your board might include things like weapon mastery here, where it's 9% swords damage. That doesn't really fit into any of the neat little buckets, so it just goes into the final bucket. So in general, it's just important to just take a look at your stats and find out like where you're lacking in the percentages, and then if you can, pump that stat up. One super easy tip to do is just to make sure you're not neglecting damage to vulnerable enemies and utilizing your vulnerable effects. Every class has a way to make things vulnerable, and because Blizzard added that effect, put it in its own bucket, and they really want you to use it. And it's probably one of the easiest and most guaranteed ways to increase your damage. Focus on the reliable buckets that you can, and your damage will skyrocket, and you'll see a huge difference in your build. That's all. Hope you have fun playing Diablo.